Snow falls on a courtyard already red. A man kneels in the frost, his hands bound with rope soaked stiff by frozen blood. Somewhere behind him, a dog barks once, then goes silent, as if it too understands that silence is safer tonight. Torches gutter along the stone wall. Smoke curls upward into a black Moscow sky, and beneath that smoke stand men dressed entirely in dark cloth, their horses draped in the same shadowed color, brooms and dog heads lashed to their saddles like grim heraldry. They do not speak. They do not need to. Their silence is the sentence. The kneeling man was, until this morning, a boyar, a nobleman of ancient blood, a man whose family had knelt to no one but God and the Grand Prince of Moscow. Now he kneels in the snow because a whisper reached the wrong ear, because a rival wanted his lands, because loyalty in this new Russia has become a currency more dangerous than gold. One of the black riders steps forward. He does not raise a sword. He raises a question instead, soft, almost gentle. Do you love the Tsar? There is no right answer. There never was. This is the world built by a boy who watched his mother die of poison before he was old enough to understand the word. A boy who was mocked by the very nobles sworn to protect him, who learned, in rooms full of adults twice his size, that power respected only fear. That boy grew into a man who would take an ancient word, loyalty, and forge it into something new. Not a virtue. A weapon. And by the time he was finished, no one in Russia would ever trust the person standing beside them again. His name was Ivan. History would call him terrible. But before the crown, before the black-robed riders, before the years of blood soaking into frozen earth, he was simply a frightened child in a palace built on knives. Moscow, in the middle of the 16th century, was not yet an empire. It was a wound still healing, a city of wooden houses crowded behind stone walls, its streets thick with mud in spring and drifted white in winter, its air carrying the smell of tallow candles, rye bread, and the ever-present tang of wood smoke. Church bells rang across the rooftops like a second heartbeat for the city, calling the faithful to prayer at hours when the sky was still black. In the markets, merchants haggled over furs and salt and silver, their breath visible in the cold, while beggars pressed themselves against monastery walls, waiting for scraps of bread that might never come. Beneath this ordinary life ran a current of something older and colder, the memory of the Mongol yoke, 2 centuries of tribute paid to foreign khans, 2 centuries of Russian princes kneeling before Tatar overlords to keep their heads attached to their shoulders. That memory had shaped the Russian soul into something wary, something that understood survival as a game played in shadows. Moscow had thrown off that yoke only a few generations earlier, and the scar tissue had not yet faded. Power, in this land, was never assumed to be safe. It was assumed to be temporary, contested, and lethal to those who held it carelessly. The boyars, the great noble families of Moscow, ruled beneath the Grand Prince like wolves circling a wounded stag. They intermarried, plotted, and murdered with the patience of men who had generations to wait. When Ivan's father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died, the boy who would become Ivan the Terrible was only 3 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent for 5 years, until she too died, almost certainly poisoned, leaving her 8-year-old son alone in a palace of predators. What followed were years the boy himself would later describe with a rage that never cooled. The boyars did not merely ignore him. They humiliated him. They let him go hungry while feasting in his presence. They killed his mother's favorite in front of him. They sat in his father's chair, wore his father's furs, and treated the anointed heir of Muscovy like an inconvenient ornament to be tolerated until he was old enough to be controlled or removed. Imagine a child, no older than 10, watching grown men drag his mother's advisor through the palace halls to be executed, the man's screams echoing off walls hung with icons of saints who did nothing to intervene. Imagine that child learning, in that single unbearable moment, the first lesson of his life: no one is safe, and no one will save you. The second lesson would come soon after. Power is the only mercy. He was fed inconsistently. He was dressed inconsistently. He was, by his own later account, treated like an orphan of the poorest household despite sitting on a throne of gilded wood. And in the empty hours between neglect and cruelty, the boy prince developed a private hobby that unsettled the servants who witnessed it. He began throwing small animals from the palace towers, watching them fall, studying with unusual concentration exactly how long it took for a living thing to stop moving. There is a particular kind of monster that is not born. It is built, piece by piece, by the hands of people who should have known better. By 13, Ivan had had enough. The rise did not begin with an army. It began with a single order, delivered by a boy not yet old enough to grow a beard, that changed the temperature of every room in the Kremlin. In December of 1543, Ivan summoned the Boyar Council, the very men who had tormented him for years, and in front of the assembled nobility, he ordered the arrest of Prince Andrei Shuaysky, the most powerful and most contemptuous of his tormentors. The guard seized Shuaysky in the palace itself. He was thrown to the hunting dogs before he reached the gate. The room went silent. Then it went very, very careful. For the first time, the boyars understood that the neglected child they had mocked for a decade possessed something none of them had accounted for: memory, and the patience to wait for the moment it could be used. Ivan was 13 years old, and he had just demonstrated that fear could flow upward as easily as it flowed down. For years later, in January of 1547, 16-year-old Ivan did something no ruler of Moscow had ever done. He was crowned not merely Grand Prince, but Tsar, a title claiming direct descent from the Roman and Byzantine emperors, from Caesar himself. It was a declaration to every neighboring power, and to every boyar who still remembered a hungry, humiliated child, that Ivan intended to rule not as a Muscovite prince among equals, but as something closer to God's chosen instrument on earth. The coronation was theatre on a scale Russia had rarely seen. Ivan was dressed in cloth of gold, crowned with the cap of Monomaque, a jeweled relic said to have been sent by a Byzantine emperor centuries before, and anointed with holy oil inside the cathedral of the Dormition, incense thick enough to make the eyes water, choirs singing in a register that seemed to come from beneath the earth rather than above it. Every boyar in that cathedral bowed. Every boyar in that cathedral was already calculating how long this boy Tsar would last. For a time, it seemed Ivan might become something extraordinary rather than something monstrous. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a young noblewoman whose warmth and piety seemed to soften something in him. Those who knew the couple described a rare gentleness in Ivan during those early years, a man who prayed beside his wife, who wept at the deaths of his children, who governed with something resembling patience. He assembled a circle of reform-minded advisers, later called the Chosen Council, and with them he rewrote Russian law, reformed the church, restructured the military, and expanded Moscow's reach east and south with genuine strategic brilliance. In 1552, Ivan personally led the siege of Kazan, the Tatar Khanate that had raided Russian lands for generations, a living reminder of the old subjugation. The siege was brutal. Russian engineers tunneled beneath the city walls and packed the tunnels with gunpowder, and when the charges detonated, the earth itself seemed to open its mouth and scream. Fire, smoke, and collapsing stone swallowed entire districts of the city. When Kazan finally fell, Ivan rode through the wreckage as church bells across Moscow rang for 3 days straight. He was 22 years old, and he had done what no Russian ruler had managed in 2 centuries. He had turned the old fear of the Tatar horde into ash beneath Russian boots. For a brief, glowing moment, it looked as though the wounded child had transformed his pain into greatness rather than ruin. Then everything changed. Behind the coronation robes and the battlefield glory, a machine was already forming, one built not on law, but on the raw psychology of dependency and dread. To understand what Ivan eventually became, one must understand the system he built to sustain it, a system with no precedent in Russian history and few equals anywhere in the world. In 1553, Ivan fell gravely ill, so close to death that he demanded his boyars swear an oath of loyalty to his infant son as heir. Many refused, or hesitated, or quietly discussed alternatives in the corridors outside his sick room while he lay feverish and listening through the walls. Ivan recovered. He did not forget. The hesitation of men he had trusted planted something in him that would never fully leave, the conviction, now confirmed by direct experience, that loyalty sworn in comfort meant nothing when tested by crisis, and that every boyar in Moscow was, at heart, a Shuaysky waiting for his moment. Then, in 1560, Anastasia died, likely poisoned, according to later forensic analysis of her remains, which showed elevated mercury levels far beyond what medicine of the era would have prescribed. Whatever gentleness had survived in Ivan died with her. He accused the boyars openly of murdering his wife. He began to see conspiracy in every glance, betrayal in every silence, poison in every cup poured by hands he had not personally watched. In December of 1564, Ivan did something that stunned all of Moscow. He loaded wagons with treasure, icons, and his family, and abandoned the capital entirely, retreating to the fortified town of Alexandrova Sloboda. From there, he sent Moscow 2 letters. The first accused the boyars and clergy of treason, cruelty, and theft, and announced his abdication. The second, addressed to the common people of Moscow, declared his love for them specifically, and blamed their suffering entirely on the corruption of the nobility. The city panicked. Without a Tsar, Moscow was a body without a spine, vulnerable to Tatar raids, Lithuanian invasion, and its own fractious nobility tearing each other apart for the throne. Delegations of merchants, clergy, and terrified boyars rode out to Alexandrova Sloboda and begged Ivan to return. He agreed, but only on one condition, delivered with the calm precision of a man who had planned every syllable in advance. He would return as absolute ruler, free to punish traitors as he saw fit, and Russia would be divided into 2 territories. One, the Zemshchina, would remain under the old boyar council, taxed and governed in the traditional manner. The other, the oprichniki, a word meaning, roughly, the separate realm, would belong entirely to Ivan, a private kingdom carved from the richest and most strategically vital lands in Russia, governed by no law but his own. And to enforce his rule within the oprichniki, Ivan created a new order of men, the oprichniki. They numbered around 1,000 at first, chosen personally, sworn to absolute loyalty to Ivan alone, forbidden even to speak to their own families if the Tsar demanded silence. They dressed entirely in black. They rode black horses. Lashed to their saddles, they carried the severed head of a dog and a broom, symbols meant to declare their purpose to anyone who saw them approach. They were the hounds who would sniff out treason. They were the broom that would sweep it from Russian soil. It is here that loyalty itself was transformed into an instrument of terror. The oprichniki were not merely soldiers. They were a cult of personal devotion, bound to Ivan through oaths that echoed monastic vows. Indeed, Ivan structured much of the oprichnika's daily ritual on the model of a monastery, with himself as abbot, his black-clad enforcers as monks, and betrayal of the order as a sin punishable not by penance but by death. Each morning, they gathered for prayer. Each night, feasts turned into interrogations, interrogations turned into torture, torture turned into execution, and Ivan, robed sometimes as Tsar and sometimes as a mock monk, presided over all of it with what witnesses described as genuine, unsettling delight. The genius, and the horror, of the system was this: loyalty to Ivan was defined as the total absence of any other loyalty. An oprichnik who protected his own family over the Tsar's demands was a traitor. A boyar who wept for a murdered relative could be accused of secretly sympathizing with treason. A merchant who hesitated a single second too long before answering a question could find that hesitation recorded, remembered, and eventually used to justify his death. Loyalty, once a bond of mutual trust between ruler and subject, became a performance that had to be renewed daily, under threat of annihilation, with no possible way to prove it had been given completely enough. This is the trap that made the machine so effective, and so monstrous. There was no ceiling to sufficient loyalty. There was only the floor of insufficient loyalty, and that floor could open beneath anyone, at any moment, for any reason, or no reason at all. The oprichniki became rich beyond the dreams of ordinary Russian nobility, granted the confiscated estates of the boyars they destroyed. This created a self-sustaining engine of terror. The more traitors they found, real or invented, the wealthier they became. Denunciation turned profitable. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Sons informed on fathers. Servants, promised a portion of their master's estate, informed on the households that had fed and clothed them their entire lives. Torture chambers were established within the oprichnika's fortress compounds, the walls soaked in smoke from the fires used to heat iron instruments, the air thick with the metallic reek of blood that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. Confessions extracted under torture were treated as proof rather than desperation. A man screaming any name to end his suffering had, in Ivan's system, just delivered a verified traitor into the hands of the state. And Ivan himself did not merely permit this machinery. He participated in it. Foreign observers, English merchants trading in Moscow, German mercenaries in Russian service, recorded scenes that seemed to belong more to nightmare than to statecraft, Ivan personally interrogating prisoners late into the night, Ivan attending executions with an expression of rapt, almost religious attention, Ivan composing detailed instructions for how certain victims should die, as though designing punishments were an art form worthy of a Tsar's personal craftsmanship. The system had one more crucial feature, perhaps the cruelest of all. Because loyalty could never be proven, only performed, the oprichniki themselves were never safe. Many of the men who had carried out the earliest purges were themselves purged in later years, accused of the very treason they had once hunted. The machine did not simply consume the boyars. It began, slowly, patiently, to consume itself. If Kazan had shown the world what Ivan's ambition could achieve, the years that followed showed what his fear could destroy. In 1558, before the oprichnina existed, Ivan had launched the Livonian War, a grinding conflict against Livonia, Lithuania, Poland, and eventually Sweden, fought over access to the Baltic Sea and the trade routes that access promised. The war would drag on for a quarter of a century, bleeding Russia of men, grain, and gold, and it forms the backdrop against which the oprichnina's terror unfolded, a nation fighting wars on its western frontier while its own Tsar hunted enemies in its eastern heart. It was into this atmosphere of external war and internal suspicion that Ivan's paranoia found its most catastrophic expression. In 1569, word reached him, through informants whose motives were, at best, deeply compromised, that the great trading city of Novgorod intended to defect to Poland-Lithuania, to abandon Moscow entirely and place itself under a rival crown. The evidence was thin. Some historians today believe it was fabricated almost entirely by rivals seeking to destroy the city's wealth and independence. It did not matter. Ivan had already decided what loyalty required. In January of 1570, Ivan marched on his own city. What followed has been described by chroniclers, foreign and domestic alike, as one of the darkest weeks in Russian history. Oprichniki sealed every road leading from Novgorod, ensuring no one could flee to warn the countryside or escape the coming judgment. Then the killing began, and it did not stop for weeks. Men, women, children, priests, merchants, peasants, entire households were dragged from their homes into the frozen streets and the icy waters of the Volkhov River, which by the end of the massacre ran clogged with corpses, its current unable to carry away the dead fast enough to hide the scale of what had happened. Chronicles describe victims bound and thrown through holes cut in the river ice, oprichniki standing at the edges with long poles, pushing beneath the surface anyone who managed to claw their way back up. Estimates of the dead range from several thousand to well over 50,000, a staggering toll for a city whose entire population may not have exceeded 30,000 people to begin with. The smell of smoke from burning granaries mixed with the metallic tang of blood on ice. Church bells that had once rung for prayer rang instead as signals for the next wave of killing. And through it all, Ivan is said to have remained calm, observant, almost meditative, a man performing a purification ritual rather than committing a massacre, convinced entirely that he was cleansing his kingdom of a rot that threatened it from within. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what came after, the realization, slow and creeping through the survivors and through history itself, that Novgorod had likely never intended treason at all. The evidence had been thin from the start, extracted through torture, invented by men who profited from the city's destruction. Ivan had not eliminated a conspiracy. He had annihilated a city on the word of liars, and in doing so had proven, permanently and to everyone still breathing in his empire, that no city, no family, and no name was ever truly safe from a Tsar convinced that loyalty could be measured in blood. The real horror came later still, when the machine Ivan had built turned, as it always eventually does, upon its architect. By the early 1570s, Ivan stood at the summit of a power that no Russian ruler before him had ever held. The oprichnina had crushed the old boyar aristocracy so thoroughly that the very concept of organized noble resistance to the Tsar had become, for a generation, almost unthinkable. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing a court where fear had replaced etiquette entirely, where men chose their words as carefully as a man crossing a frozen river chooses his footing, aware that one wrong step could open the ice beneath him. Ivan's wealth, drawn from the confiscated estates flowing endlessly into the oprichnina's coffers, financed a court of extraordinary, almost delirious opulence, banquets that stretched across days, gold plate stacked in towers taller than the servants who carried it, foreign delicacies imported at ruinous expense simply to demonstrate that the Tsar's reach extended even to tables in Persia and the Italian coast. He commissioned church building on a scale meant to rival Byzantium itself, and Moscow's skyline, still today, bears the fingerprints of this era of terrible, magnificent ambition. And yet, for all this glittering power, those closest to Ivan described a man who slept poorly, who startled at sudden sounds, who kept armed guards within arm's reach even in his private chambers, who trusted almost no one enough to let them stand behind him. Power, in Ivan's world, had become a throne built entirely of enemies he had not yet found, and a man cannot rest easily upon a throne like that, no matter how tall it stands. He was, by this point in his reign, addressed with a title few rulers in history had claimed so completely: Tsar of all the Russias, conqueror of Kazan and Astrakhan, terror of the Tartars, scourge of traitors. Foreign courts that had once dismissed Muscovy as a backward frontier now sent ambassadors bearing careful, deferential gifts. Ivan had, by any external measure, achieved what the humiliated child in the palace of predators could never have imagined, a Russia that knelt to him as completely as the boyars had once made him kneel to their contempt. But every empire built on fear carries within it a debt that eventually comes due. The cost of Ivan's terror was not paid only by the boyars, the merchants of Novgorod, or the countless nameless victims whose deaths never made it into any chronicle. It was paid, in the end, by Ivan himself, in a currency more intimate than gold: his own mind, his own family, his own capacity to trust or be trusted by another living soul. By the mid-1570s, the oprichniki as a formal institution had been quietly dissolved, in part because it had grown too powerful even for Ivan's comfort, in part because its endless purges had begun crippling the very economy and military the Tsar needed to survive his ongoing wars. But dissolving the institution did not dissolve the psychology that had built it. Ivan replaced the black-robed order with new structures bearing different names but carrying the same essential logic. Informants rewarded, dissent punished, and loyalty measured not by service but by submission. His personal life collapsed alongside his political stability. Ivan married repeatedly, 7 or 8 wives across his lifetime, an almost unheard-of number for a Christian monarch of the era, several marriages ending in the convenient death or forced monastic exile of the wife in question. Court gossip, recorded by foreign visitors with varying degrees of reliability, described a man whose private appetites had grown as unrestrained as his political cruelty, a Tsar who treated his own household with the same suspicion he had once reserved for rebellious boyars. And then, in November of 1581, the terror that Ivan had spent decades directing outward turned, in a single unbearable moment, inward. His son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, a young man of considerable promise who some historians believe might have tempered his father's worst instincts had he lived to inherit the throne, confronted the Tsar over a matter involving the younger Ivan's pregnant wife. Accounts vary as to the precise cause, some describing a dispute over the young woman's clothing, others a disagreement over military strategy in the ongoing Livonian War. What is not disputed is the outcome. In a fit of rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son with the iron-tipped staff he always carried, a symbol of his authority that had, in an instant, become the instrument of his greatest devastation. The blow landed on the young man's temple. He collapsed. He lingered for several agonizing days, his father reportedly kneeling beside him in a grief so total that witnesses feared the Tsar himself might not survive it, weeping and begging forgiveness from a son who could no longer answer him. On the 19th of November, Ivan Ivanovich died. The man who had built an empire on the conviction that loyalty must be tested, enforced, and punished when found wanting had, in a single ungoverned moment, destroyed the one loyalty that had never needed enforcing at all, the bond between a father and a son who, whatever their disputes, had never once been his enemy. There is a particular silence that falls over a palace after a scream like that one. Servants who had grown accustomed to the sounds of torture in distant chambers found themselves unable to move at the sound of a father's grief. Even fear, it turned out, had never prepared them for this. Ivan never fully recovered. Those close to him in his final years described a man aged well beyond his time, his body swollen and afflicted with what modern forensic analysis of his remains suggests may have been a combination of chronic stress, heavy metal poisoning from the mercury-based treatments common in that era, and possibly syphilis. a body failing in ways that mirrored the disintegration of the empire he had spent his life fortifying against enemies both real and imagined. The Livonian War, which had consumed a quarter-century and untold Russian lives, ended in 1583 not in triumph but in humiliating concession, Russia forced to surrender territory it had bled for a generation to claim. The oprichnika's purges had left the countryside depopulated, entire villages abandoned, agricultural production collapsed so severely that famine stalked provinces that had once fed the empire. The very nobility Ivan had spent decades terrorizing into submission now watched their Tsar decline with an exhaustion too deep even for satisfaction. There is little triumph in outliving a tyrant when the land itself has been left in ruins. And with the death of his eldest son, the only heir capable, by most accounts, of governing effectively, Ivan's succession now rested on his younger son Fyodor, a gentle, deeply pious young man widely regarded, even by contemporaries who loved him, as unsuited to rule a kingdom still crawling with the wolves his father had only temporarily caged. The empire Ivan had built through terror had no foundation sturdy enough to survive without him, because terror, by its very nature, cannot be inherited. It can only be wielded, and Ivan alone had ever fully mastered its use. In March of 1584, Ivan sat down to play chess with one of his remaining advisors. Witnesses described him as unusually calm that morning, almost peaceful, a rare stillness settling over a man who had spent 5 decades on a throne built from other men's blood. He collapsed before the game was finished. He died within hours. What killed Ivan the Terrible remains, even now, a matter of genuine historical dispute, the mystery as fitting an end as any for a man who had spent his life making certainty itself a dangerous thing to claim. Soviet-era exhumation of his remains in the 20th century revealed mercury levels far exceeding safe limits, evidence consistent with the medicinal poisons of his era, but also consistent, some scholars argue, with deliberate assassination by court rivals who had waited decades for their moment and finally, quietly, found it. Others point to the sheer physical toll of his final years, the illnesses, the swelling, the reported symptoms of a body in slow, agonizing collapse, as sufficient explanation without any need for conspiracy. Perhaps, in the end, it does not matter which theory is correct. Perhaps it is fitting that a man who built his reign on the impossibility of ever proving loyalty should die in a manner impossible to prove conclusively either way. What is known is this. The chessboard was never finished. The pieces stood exactly where his hand had left them, a game interrupted mid-thought, as though even death itself had refused to wait for Ivan to make his final move. Bells rang across Moscow that day, the same bells that had once rung for the fall of Kazan, the same bells that had tolled through the massacre of Novgorod, the same bells that had called the faithful to prayer through 5 decades of glory and horror equally impossible to separate from one another. In the streets, some wept. Many, in the privacy of their own homes, allowed themselves for the first time in years to breathe without calculating who might be listening. Snow falls on a courtyard already red. It falls, still, in the memory of a nation that has never fully decided what to make of the man who ruled it through fear disguised as devotion. Ivan the Terrible expanded Russia's borders further than any Tsar before him. He crushed the old aristocracy that had humiliated him as a child, and in doing so cleared the ground for a centralized state that would, centuries later, become one of the largest empires the world has ever known. He built cathedrals whose domes still catch the Moscow light. He is, by any measure of raw historical consequence, one of the architects of the nation Russia eventually became. Others point to the sheer physical toll of his final years, the illnesses, the swelling, the reported symptoms of a body in slow, agonizing collapse, as sufficient explanation without any need for conspire. And he did all of it by teaching an entire kingdom that loyalty was not a bond between equals but a debt that could never be fully repaid, a performance that had to be renewed daily, under threat of the river ice, under threat of the black-robed riders with their dog's head and broom, under threat of a Tsar who wept over his dying son with the same hands that had ordered a city drowned beneath a winter river. This is the warning buried inside every empire built on terror rather than trust. The machinery of suspicion does not stop at the border its architect intends. It does not distinguish, in the end, between enemy and family, between traitor and son. It consumes outward until there is nothing left to consume but the very thing it was built to protect. Ivan spent his life ensuring that no one around him could ever feel safe enough to betray him, and in the process, he ensured that no one around him, not his boyars, not his oprichniki, not even his own children, could ever feel safe enough to truly love him either. He wanted a kingdom where every subject would prove, without end, that their devotion was real. What he built instead was a kingdom where devotion had become indistinguishable from fear, where the two had been fused so completely that neither the Tsar nor his people could any longer tell them apart. The snow keeps falling on that courtyard, in the place where history keeps it forever midfall, forever red beneath the white. And somewhere in that frozen stillness stands the lesson Ivan never learned in time to save his son, his empire, or himself, that a loyalty enforced by terror is not loyalty at all. It is merely fear, waiting patiently for the day the man who demanded it finally closes his eyes.